Okay, well, first of all, I will define how I see global history. Basically, I see it as an attempt to think globally, that is, in the first instance, beyond the nation, but also beyond the idea of a singular nation. I mean, when you think of Indigenous peoples, there are many Indigenous nations within these modern colonial or imperial or post-colonial nations. So that's one thing. But it also means thinking beyond the comparative. You know, you're not looking at one case study and another, but you're thinking much more widely. Another point is that global history really is too ambitious in some ways, because you cannot cover the entire globe in a comprehensive way. However, there are very important global questions, which I'm sure all the speakers will be mentioning. I mean, as a planet, we are facing this great pandemic at the moment, which has had a devastating impact. We're facing the climate crisis, and there's many other issues, even the challenge to democracy. These really have global resonance. When you look at the history of Indigenous people, that is a wide global history of many different empires having impacts on Indigenous people. So hence we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That's an example of a global initiative which looks at global history as really being fundamental to shaping the experiences of Indigenous people today. And I think with environmental history, that also has to have a global resonance. Even what's happening with artificial intelligence and technology now, that also has global resonance. So that's one of the main reasons I became interested in global history, because I was very interested in the history of imperialism and colonialism and racism. But also when I started to get interested in gender and imperialism, bringing them together as themes, you really see it's not a history of one nation or even of one empire. It really is a history of global resonance. So I guess, yeah, to go back to your question of defining it, I just think it's thinking beyond the parochial. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with thinking locally, but it's also taking it wider than that.
Thank you, Ann. Let's go to the second question.
Thank you, Professor. What are the possibilities of dialogue between local and global, micro and macro?
Well, I think that's a very important question for historians, and it's one that I did think deeply about when I was invited by the American Historical Review to be part of a conversation with other historians with different regional specialties around the globe. And that was a very interesting experience. But one of the things that came up was, is global history going to weaken what are the strengths of our discipline of history? Because after all, we're very good at interrogating texts and looking very closely at the micro. And as a historian, I really enjoy looking at the lives of individuals. You find their idiosyncrasies, the surprises about them. There's so many awe-inspiring things about when you do look at texts and look at individuals. But I think we've got to get beyond thinking that the text is the only way to understand history. For example, I've been working quite a bit on deep history. I've set up a new centre for research into deep history at the Australian National University. And one of the most fascinating cases is that of a woman called Lady Mungo, who lived 42,000 years ago, an Indigenous woman who lived on the lands of the Muddy, Nampa and Barkindji people in around an ancient Pleistocene lake called Lake Mungo, and hence she got the name Lady Mungo from the Aboriginal owners of the area. And I was wanting to understand how we could expand the scale of history, and I was wanting to think, well, how can we tell the story of Australia's deep past, before Captain Cook and the Europeans came in 1770 and 1788. And to me, the fact that there was this human burial, cremation, enabled me to think of the micro of an individual who lived at that time, who had a life, who lived and loved and died. And, you know, that historical imagination can often be sparked by thinking about an individual, thinking about her community near this lake. So to me, I think the micro is really important. But then we can also think of a character like Lady Mungo as part of global history. When did Aboriginal people first arrive on the continent of Australia? Where did they come from? What were their traditions and cultures they brought with them that they shared with other people around that same time? And so I guess I do see rich history telling needs the micro, but we also need to think, well, what is the wider relevance? What are the big questions for humanity? If it's possible to use big data, that's good too. I don't think historians are that good at that yet. And so I'm quite keen to work with scientists. So we are interested in working with archaeologists, with dating experts, with DNA experts. So I think in order to do something in relation to the scale, the temporal scale of history, as well as the spatial scale, we as historians do need to get a new toolkit and to learn to collaborate with scientists who, as we know, think quite differently to us. And I've just been listening to a big a scientific symposium all week, and while I find it fascinating, there's big gaps in the way we argue a case, the way we write our work, and yeah, so it's not only the gaps in time and space, we've also got to deal with these gaps between specializations in the academy. And Indigenous knowledge is absolutely crucial. And that is really one of the main ways we're going to learn about how to tell these deep time stories. And so when I spend time with the Indigenous traditional owners of this Lake Mungo area, they already have wonderful ways to tell stories, and they don't see a gap really between their own time and their own lives and the lives of Lady Mungo. Like, they don't see 42,000 years as being something they've got to traverse, because they feel she's still alive and she's still in their presence. Her spirit is shaping the world they're in today. And so they have a different view of temporality, which I think jumps a bit to the next question, or one of the next questions.
Thank you again. Let's go to the third question.
How to work with the multiple temporalities in global history? Is there a short global history?
Well, I have been very interested in deep history, which I define as expanding the scale, the temporal scale of history. And I feel that historians have been too stuck in modernity and looking at modern time, looking at the last 200 years. In Australia, for example, a very large continent in the south, we have been unfortunately obsessed by starting our history in 1770 when Captain Cook arrived, or 1788 when the first convict colonists arrived. Well, perhaps they didn't know they were being colonists at the time, but it was the first European settlement at Port Jackson, Sydney Cove. Now, this is a very short history, and yet all our school books started with these European arrivals. And if they did talk about Aboriginal history, they never mentioned that they had already discovered Australia. It was always Captain Cook discovered Australia. And so in my work, I'm trying to dismantle that idea of that discoverer narrative being the beginning of history. And when you look at it, there's reasons for this. The whole discipline's been set up according to analysing the text. So it was Captain Cook that left his logbooks, and then the first fleet arrivals in 1788 left journals which were published. And so these are the first written text-based records. So I don't think we should write short histories of anything, like a continent like Australia. They've now shown the dates 65,000 years for Majubibi in the north, which is in the Northern Territory of Australia. And the speculation that the dates of first Aboriginal occupation could go beyond that. So why on earth do we have school textbooks saying Australia was discovered in 1770, and why should history start then? Well, part of it is because we don't know really how to write histories that go further back. So that's a big challenge to our profession. And we need to work with climate scientists, geomorphologists, with geologists, geographers, water specialists, but there are some very interesting themes. And I guess environmental historians are already starting to pave the way in this sense. But is there a short global history? Well, people have been writing these big histories, but basically I'm a bit skeptical of the meta-narratives in these big histories, because they often do emphasize progress, a sort of march forward of humanity. Complexity is a key theme, which they borrow from science, and there's a little bit of a sort of celebratory notion that after the European Enlightenment, everything just gets more and more complex and better and so on. And this tends to ignore the fact that many Indigenous societies were extremely complex too. They had traditions of art, they had storytelling traditions which retain factual information going back at least 20,000 years of islands forming, volcanoes happening. So they had their own historical traditions, which I think the history profession hasn't paid enough attention to. We haven't even called them histories, we call them myths or legends. But I think we need to realise that we have our own myths in the way we've narrated Western style history. So I think it's a very provocative question. Is there a short global history? I'm actually co-editing at the moment a Routledge companion to Indigenous global history. And I must say, writing any global history, and we've got 30 contributors, it's been very challenging, and it probably does overemphasize modern history, the shorter timescale of history. And I hope that gradually changes, that we can see that humanity has lived for many more years than modernity, as we defined it, has been going on. And I'm quite influenced by Daniel Smale's work, where he actually talks about the whole hominid history as being part of human history and how we should think of ourselves as animals. And it's also interesting to think of history in relation to the non-human and the whole environment in which people lived. So, but I guess as a historian, I am most interested in people. So perhaps my short global history would start with the coming of people to wherever you want to start on the planet to start to tell their story.
Thank you, Ann, again.
Does every type of research object have the potential to become a source of global history?
Do you mean a material object, like material culture, or do you mean a subject or a theme of history?
Sorry. I think the idea here for the question is a theme or an object like a text, or could become something that we can think of. Is anything potentially support for our thinking on and producing on global history?
Yes, it's fascinating to think of like any one thing and how that relates to global history. I have started to get very fascinated in this story, which relates to clay the actual mineral, the thing that we make pottery out of, that beautiful ceramics. And once you start to think of a simple material like clay, there are many amazing stories about its uses. I found, for example, that the Aboriginal people of Australia use it to make beautiful body paint designs. They also used clay to line their dwellings and their canoes. And then when the British arrived, they got very interested in the fine white clay that they saw around Sydney Cove. And some of the French that arrived in La Perouse's expedition actually talked to the British. They talked to Governor Phillip and said, oh, this would make fine ceramic clay. And one of the reasons the British were so interested in it was because of the early factory system. Wedgwood was starting up industrial-sized pottery in competition with China. So once you start to think of these stories, they become very globally connected. And then the British actually decided to try out this clay in the Wedgwood factory. It's a long story. I won't go into the whole thing. But they ended up making this tiny little ceramic medallion, only this big, with a theme of hope, using allegories from Greek myths. And then it's like a souvenir of hope for this new colony. And they also had truth and art, labour in there as well, in this tiny little symbolic ceramic, which proved the wonders of British pottery arts. And then they sent that back to Sydney Cove. So not only is this clay going all the way over to Europe, coming back, being reinterpreted through the iconography of Greek mythology, being taken to a land that's rich in its own story and mythology, which the British are ignoring. And so I'm hoping to write a book about that story and to think about how old that clay is and how that clay had very different meanings and uses in different cultures, and how it was transported. And in fact, it caused a flurry of interest amongst European scientists. They thought it was the primitive Earth example. They also started to do analyses of it. And then once you start to look at the characters involved, a lot of them are quite famous in the Enlightenment. So it gets you thinking about intellectual history. So to me, this is just an example of how so many things are connected, and they're not only connected locally, but they're circulating around. Ideas are circulating, things are circulating. And of course, David Christian always tells the story of the mobile phone, but that's more of a big history story, because he talks about how it's made of ingredients from outer space, interactions with the planet. And, I do love this idea of the small thing that we just walk around with every day, and how historians can think about them so differently, not only their cultural history, but their material culture history.
Thanks, Professor. What are the main risks and challenges in global history?
I think one of the main risks in global history is that we think we've got to be totally comprehensive about the whole globe. To me, global history can raise important questions that are relevant to the globe, relevant to the planet. But they might look at global interactions, like the story I just told you about. But I think to really understand the kind of history that's gone on in the South or on a particular continent does require close historical knowledge of the context. So I do think it's really important for historians to specialise so they have a depth of knowledge in a particular place and perhaps also a particular period. But that doesn't mean they can't link that to other periods. I think sometimes as historians we get too stuck in this is my period, and that I think sometimes juxtaposing different specializations, whether that be in different regions, different nations, different Indigenous peoples, can be very rich too. Not only a story of connectedness, but a story of difference and common themes. And as far as the challenges go, I think it is the need to expand our disciplines so that we can gain knowledge from other disciplines, including scientific areas, and new research in DNA, dating, and so forth. We need to be able to integrate Indigenous knowledge in this. And sometimes when people look at global big picture, they're relying too much on text, and they find it too difficult to have the patience to develop respectful relationships with Indigenous people and to learn from how they want to teach us as historians to understand their past and their future. But I think the challenges are exciting, and I especially welcome the idea of thinking about history from the South, because the whole of human history, including the history, deep history, the history of hominids, it's always been so Eurocentric. Like there was that idea that in Europe there were Neanderthals at a certain time, and there was a great focus on how people came from Africa to Europe. And there really had hardly been any research done on how early humans came to the South. And so it was quite a revelation when Lady Mungo's remains were found to be 42,000 years before the present, because it was thought that only Neanderthals even existed then in Europe. And just to clarify that was in the late 1960s. So I realise that's changed a lot now that that her remains were found. But I think you look at the history profession, and it's been very Eurocentric. The very definition of history, philology, it did come out of European universities, Germany and England, and even now a lot of the strongest Ivy League type universities tend to be in the wealthy nations in the Northern Hemisphere. And so there's just a plethora of huge amount of work that has happened in the Northern Hemisphere. And I think that often those scholars forget about the Southern Hemisphere. And I do remember going to a presentation at Harvard about early human migration around the globe. And they actually didn't even show the part of the globe that included Australia, which I did notice. But I know that once you include the Pacific and Australia, it takes up extra space on your PowerPoint. But that was considered just quite usual because that's a different story that they hadn't linked in. And in many ways, I think maybe global history hasn't linked in the whole history of the South adequately. To this point, because of that overemphasis on Europe and the North, and perhaps the Western Hemisphere, as North Americans call that area of the world.
Thank you, Ann. Very nice to hear you learn with all your speech. We're very happy to that you could be part of our program and event, and to hear all your ideas. And well, we're done with the 5 questions for our symposium, but I would like to ask you then, this is out of our script here, because we have in our program lots of research groups, different research groups. They're gender, environmental, and art, and politics. And there's one specific that's ethnohistory, indigenous history, and archaeology, which the 3 of us are engaged. And if you accept, we would put 2 additional questions that wouldn't go to the symposium, but we could, if you think that's okay, we could also edit it for more specific Indigenous history questions about your research, so that we could use also to show to students and put it in our website, if you think that's okay. We would, it's just very simple, but not so simple questions, just to hear a little more about your own research and your new project and how does that dialogue and work with all this, how did you build it up with all this collaboration with the indigenous populations and all this interdisciplinary approach that you've been constructing for so many years, and it's an inspiration for us here in Brazil. It's a very different indigenous situation, and also a very different research questions and also how this Eurocentric approach came to us is also in a different manner. But in spite of that, there are lots of inspiring forms of how to construct this interdisciplinary research, and how to specifically try to put that into this history department, and how to build this bridge with what is indigenous history and what is history, and how to deepen that into a deep history with indigenous, constructed with indigenous, and not about indigenous as lots of history has been done. So it's just, if you can and understand, if you cannot, but we would love to hear more about your own experience.
Oh yeah, no, that's okay. I've got some more time. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I was wondering, I hope that I'm not like speaking too fast for the audience or have an odd Australian accent that you can't understand.
No, it's fine. It's very, it's easy for us to understand. It's okay. Not easy, but we can understand.
Yeah, well, it has been a great privilege for me to start up this new centre. I won a laureate, which is an Australian Research Centre funded fellowship, and that enables me to employ some postdoctoral researchers and have some wonderful PhD students and a project manager and a web developer. And so we have many aims. It's a 5-year project, but for many years I've been trying to get beyond the idea that Indigenous history, particularly Australian Indigenous history, started with the coming of the Europeans. I've been a specialist, I guess, in a field you call Aboriginal history, really from very early in my career, because I was very interested in racism, but also gender and imperialism. And I wrote books and collaborated on books that were during the colonial period. So they're very much about Aboriginal European relations, Aboriginal people and colonialism, Aboriginal people working in the cattle industry and making it their own in a very transformative, exciting way on Australian cattle stations in between the 2 world wars. And then I also wrote a book called Contested Ground, which was starting in 1788, and it was a state-by-state history in Australia of Aboriginal policies and Aboriginal experiences and so forth. I'm just giving you some examples of the kind of work I've done. I also wrote a feminist history along with 3 other women, which was called Creating a Nation. And again, we started in 1788, the arrival of the Europeans. So one of my motivations for starting this research centre for deep history was to get away from the framing of history as beginning with the arrival of Europeans, getting away from the idea that you had to start with a discovery or even a contact between outsiders and Indigenous people. So I think that even the new theorisation about settler colonialism is reinforcing this. So it does bring many challenges, and one of our main aims is to work with people holding Indigenous knowledge, with leading Indigenous organisations, and we want to think about how they think about history, we want to learn about that, and to view their historical traditions and modes of historical practice as being informative and valuable and deserving a place in historiography, and then benefiting from the knowledge of these. I don't want to use the word evidence, because Aboriginal people often don't see their ancestors as evidence. They find it quite insulting when scientists talk about bones of their ancestors, because they say no, that they're human remains, they're a spirit, that's our auntie. And they don't have that sense of a temporal distance, even between someone who may have died 50,000 years ago. They don't have that idea of the gap, because they have more of a sense of an every-when and multiple temporalities happening simultaneously, which is a challenging and interesting idea for the history profession. We tend to be so set in our periodizations. Something starts with this date, ends with that date. And I've certainly learnt from Aboriginal people that they don't think that way about dates, and their history is very place-based in landscapes. So we've set up a collaboration with the Yawu people, who are in Broome in Western Australia. It's an absolutely beautiful place. It's a very tidal landscape, and the local people have a lot of knowledge, and they're having a language revival of the Yawu language. They're very proud of their culture. And they talk of this idea of lian as a sense of well-being when they're in their country. And they've created a seasonal calendar, which looks very beautiful, and it's divided the whole year into these very nuanced seasons of when certain flowers bloom, certain fish are around, and all this type of thing. And I think that non-Indigenous people grab onto that and go, oh, this is the way Aboriginal people think about time. And they're very quick to explain to us that, no, that's just something that Europeans find very appealing, to have this paper representation diagram of the way we think of time. The way we think of time is actually, it is according to the seasons, but it's being in place. And so if something happened in a certain season, that's when it's happened. So I'm trying to explain that it's not the calendar date, it's the season and the place that creates the time and place element. That's a different way of thinking about history, because the traditional, the way we've been trained in the Western Academy is to think of a date and a place, and a Gregorian calendar date is very much part of a Christian tradition. So yes, I may be sounding like I'm getting off the topic here, but our centre is also wanting to look at different kinds of ways of understanding the past beyond the text. So one of our emphases in 2021, now that fortunately Australia's state borders are now open, because we're in the very good position of having controlled the coronavirus epidemic. So fortunately the state borders are opening, and we can now do field work again. Whereas this year we couldn't do any field work with remote Indigenous communities, because the government was very concerned about protecting them from health outbreaks, because they already have, unfortunately, very poor health compared with other Australians, those living in remote communities in particular. And I am really excited about doing field work in North Queensland, and also with the Yawu people in Broome when their borders open. And I want to emphasise the theme of rock art. So surprisingly, historians in Australia, I don't know whether it's the same in Brazil, perhaps not, they have ignored rock art as a form of evidence. And yet Indigenous people will say, this is our archive. This is the closest thing we have to a record of our past. And rock art does, it records early contact with Europeans. It records earliest boat scene. It records what the first Europeans were wearing, their guns. But it also records animals that are now extinct. And it records sacred rituals and headdresses and dances and complex rituals. And there's so much richness in cave art, and yet to date it has only been scientists really looking at rock art. And so I'm pleased to say we've now got a project with some leading rock art experts, and we'll be working with the local Indigenous people to interpret that art in Quincan country and other areas. And I mean, I don't really even know what questions we as historians will ask of rock art, but I think we need to be there on the ground, thinking about the questions, talking to the Indigenous owners about how they interpret the art and how they see it as an archive of both European contact, but also of their deeper past, going way back in time. And of course, rock art can be dated now. Gradually, they're improving the dating techniques. And once again, it's a clue of how to get back beyond the European-generated written text.